pirates try to attack the mighty ships of the US Navy. You know, those that are armed to the teeth and equipped with state-of-the-art technology.
6 men in a speeding skiff thought they had found an easy prize.
Identified several small boats.
A lone freighter drifting across calm waters. They raised their rifles and opened fire. What they didn't know, the freighter was a US Navy warship waiting for them. Setting the stage. For centuries, the waters off Somalia were little more than a passageway for local fishermen and international trade. Then, in the early 1990s, everything collapsed. When Somalia's central government fell apart in 1991, the coastline, stretching more than 3,000 kilometers, was left unguarded. No Coast Guard, no Navy, no authority to enforce the rules of the sea. Foreign vessels soon took advantage. Industrial trawlers stripped Somali waters of fish, devastating local livelihoods. At the same time, reports surfaced of toxic waste being dumped along the coast. With no government to stop it, the country's fishing families watched their waters plundered and poisoned. What began as local fishermen trying to defend their waters soon spiraled into something darker. Skiffs armed with AK-47s started targeting passing cargo ships. At first, they called themselves Coast Guards, demanding payments for protection. But the ransoms grew, and so did the stakes. By the mid-2000s, piracy was no longer survival. It was big business. Billions of dollars in global trade moved through these same waters, and each unguarded freighter became a potential jackpot. Desperation had turned into enterprise, and the Gulf of Aden had become the most dangerous shipping lane on Earth. The wrong target. To the untrained eye, the vessel cutting across the Gulf of Aden that April morning might have looked like a slow, lumbering freighter. It was gray, boxy, and massive, exactly the kind of ship Somali pirates had learned to stalk. From a distance, 6 men in a skiff imagined millions of dollars worth of cargo and hostages waiting for the taking. But the ship they had spotted was not a merchant vessel. It was the USS Ashland, a Whidbey Island-class dock landing ship of the United States Navy. Commissioned in 1989, the Ashland was built for far more than transport. At full load, it displaced over 16,000 tons and carried Marines, amphibious landing craft, armored vehicles, and weapon systems designed to crush small surface threats long before they got close. On board were sailors and Marines trained not just for war, but for every unpredictable encounter the sea could throw at them: disaster relief, evacuations, and yes, piracy. The ship's advanced radar systems and sharp-eyed lookouts had already noticed the approaching skiff, long before the pirates even realized what they were chasing. The men in the small boat thought they were hunters. In truth, they had stumbled onto a predator far more powerful than they could ever imagine. The encounter. The Gulf of Aden was deceptively calm that morning. Blue skies, flat seas, and a faint haze clinging to the horizon. For the 6 men in the skiff, it seemed like the perfect day to strike. They had their target in sight, and the prize looked unguarded. As they closed the distance, the pirates raised their rifles. The skiff's outboard motor roared, propelling them directly toward the Ashland's port side. Shots rang out, the crack of small arms fire echoing over the water. To the attackers, it must have felt like the first step toward another ransom payday. But on the Ashland's deck, there was no panic. This was not an unarmed freighter. This was a warship bristling with sensors, Marines, and weapon systems designed exactly for this moment. The rules of engagement were clear. Once fired upon, the ship had full authority to defend itself. The order was given. Sailors brought the Mk-38 Mod 2 chain gun to bear. Stabilized, remote-controlled, and deadly accurate, it was locked on target. In seconds, 2 25mm rounds ripped across the water and slammed into the skiff. The effect was instant. The small boat erupted in flames, fire racing across its wooden hull. Smoke plumed into the sky. The pirates screamed, leaping overboard in desperation. What began as an attack had turned into a fight for survival, and just like that, the battle was over. In less than a minute, the hunters had become castaways, floating helplessly in the shadow of the very ship they thought they could conquer. From battle to rescue. The skiff was destroyed, but the story did not end with fire and smoke. In the water below, 6 men struggled against the waves, their boat sinking behind them. They were pirates, yes, armed attackers who had just fired on a U.S. Navy vessel. But they were also human beings now clinging to life. On board the Ashland, the mission changed in an instant. Once the threat was neutralized, the crew's training shifted to rescue. 2 rigid-hull inflatable boats were launched, cutting across the water toward the survivors. Armed Marines stood ready in case the men still carried concealed weapons. But the priority was clear: save lives. One by one, the pirates were pulled from the sea. Each was searched, stripped of weapons, and brought aboard under guard. Some were shaken, coughing seawater, while others bore burns from the fire or signs of hypothermia from the sudden plunge. Navy corpsmen went to work immediately, tending to wounds and stabilizing each man. For the Ashland's crew, this dual role was nothing new. They were trained to fight with deadly precision, yet also to deliver humanitarian aid when required. In this moment, the same sailors who had fired the 25mm cannon minutes earlier were now administering medical care to the very men who had tried to kill them. The contrast was stark, but it was also a reflection of the Navy's doctrine: neutralize the threat, preserve human life, and uphold international law. The bigger picture. The attack on the Ashland was dramatic, but it was not unique. In the span of just 10 days in 2010, 3 separate U.S. Navy warships faced off against Somali pirates. On March 31st, the USS Nicholas engaged a skiff that opened fire near the Seychelles, capturing 5 pirates. Days later, on April 5th, the USS McFall responded to a distress call from the commercial vessel Rising Sun. 10 pirates were captured in that rescue. Then came April 10th, when the Ashland added 6 more to the tally. In less than 2 weeks, the Navy had detained 21 suspected pirates. It was a clear signal to the world. The Gulf of Aden was under watch, and attacks would be met with swift retaliation. At the time, piracy was not just a nuisance, it was a global crisis. Between 2008 and 2011, hundreds of ships were attacked in the waters off Somalia. Ransoms paid to pirate groups reached hundreds of millions of dollars. Some vessels were held for months, their crews trapped in appalling conditions while negotiations dragged on. NATO, the European Union, and a coalition known as Combined Maritime Forces established patrols in the region. Task Force 151, a multinational unit dedicated to counter piracy, became a constant presence. For merchant sailors passing through the narrow choke point between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, these patrols were often the only reassurance that someone was watching. Yet even with international warships in the region, the threat remained. Somali piracy was unpredictable, ruthless, and rooted in deeper problems that no naval gun could fix. The global stakes. To understand why navies from across the globe poured resources into these waters, you need to look at the map. The Gulf of Aden, squeezed between the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, is one of the busiest maritime highways on Earth. Each year, nearly 22,000 vessels transit this corridor, carrying crude oil from the Middle East, manufactured goods from Asia, and food supplies bound for Europe and North America. It is a lifeline of globalization. Block it, and fuel prices rise. Disrupt it, and entire supply chains fracture. The world's most powerful economies cannot afford instability here. That is why NATO frigates, U.S. destroyers, Indian patrol craft, and Chinese warships all share the same waters, watching for the same threat. For the pirates, a slow-moving freighter represented ransom worth millions. For the families of the sailors aboard, every voyage carried the nightmare possibility of capture. Some crews were locked away for months, their relatives receiving desperate calls from kidnappers demanding money. This is why incidents like the Ashland encounter mattered far beyond one flaming skiff. They were not just about 6 men in a boat. They were about proving that the sea would not be abandoned to lawlessness, and that global commerce would be defended with force if necessary. Justice on land. Once the 6 men were secured aboard the Ashland, the question became, what now? Under international law, piracy is considered a universal crime. Any nation has the authority to detain and prosecute those captured at sea. But in practice, the process is rarely straightforward. Often suspected pirates were transferred to regional partners like Kenya or the Seychelles, where legal frameworks were already in place to handle such cases. That was the path for the Ashland's attackers. After being held in custody, they were handed over to Kenyan authorities, charged with piracy in Indian Ocean waters. What followed was a long series of trials and appeals. Some of the men received lengthy prison sentences. Others faced life in prison without the possibility of release. For them, the gamble of chasing ships across the Gulf of Aden ended not with riches, but with decades behind bars. The prosecutions were also meant as a warning. Each conviction was a message to pirate networks on the Somali coast. International forces would not only destroy your boats, they would hold you accountable in courts of law. Still, the legal process highlighted the complexities of fighting piracy. Different nations had different rules, and many were reluctant to shoulder the burden of prosecution. For every group brought to justice, others slipped back to shore, free to try again. Decline and resurgence. For a brief time, it seemed the world had beaten Somali piracy. By 2012, the number of successful hijackings dropped sharply. Several factors combined to drive the decline. Naval patrols became constant and aggressive. Merchant ships began sailing in convoys through designated corridors, and many companies hired private security teams, often former military personnel, who brought rifles and tactics that pirates could not easily challenge. The risks for attackers grew too high. A skiff that once might have earned millions in ransom was more likely to end in arrest, imprisonment, or death. Pirate bases along the Somali coast were raided, their camps destroyed, their supply chains disrupted. By the late 2000s and 10s, international monitors reported some of the lowest levels of piracy in 2 decades. For the first time in years, the Gulf of Aden was no longer considered the world's most dangerous shipping lane. But the sea has a way of reminding us that no victory is permanent. In early 2024, piracy flared again. The Bangladeshi vessel MV Abdullah was hijacked by Somali gunmen. Weeks later, EU naval forces intercepted pirates who had attacked the Crystal Arctic in the same waters. In a dramatic operation, the Indian Navy freed a bulk carrier and captured 35 Somali pirates, the largest such roundup in years. These incidents showed what experts have long warned. Piracy is not eradicated, only suppressed. As long as poverty, weak governance, and lawlessness persist on land, the temptation to hunt ships at sea will return. The pirates thought they had found prey. Instead, they collided with a warship that answered with fire, then rescue. The USS Ashland's encounter remains a warning. The sea is never lawless, and those who test it must face both justice and humanity.